Welcome back to Health Law Pulse, the podcast where we explore how healthcare, leadership, and law intersect in the real world. I'm your host, John Rhodes, healthcare attorney and founder of Health Law Counsel, LLC. Today's episode is a little different. We're bringing together two experienced in-house healthcare lawyers who sit in very different parts of the industry, but deal with many of the same core challenges. My guests today are Greg Gambill, Vice President Associate General Counsel at Acumen, and Jeff Williams, General Counsel and Head of Pharma Solutions at Evio Pharmacy Solutions. Between the two of them, they've advised healthcare organizations across provider systems, diagnostics, pharmacy, and data-driven healthcare companies, each with its own unique regulatory landscape, but all operating under increasing pressure to manage risk while continuing to innovate. In my experience, some of the most interesting legal and compliance issues in healthcare don't come from the regulations themselves. They come from how those regulations interact with real-world operations, incentives, and decision-making inside organizations. In this conversation, we talk about how regulatory risk differs across healthcare settings, what compliance lessons apply regardless of size or specialty, and what it actually looks like when legal compliance and operations work together effectively. We also get into where compliance problems really begin, what separates organizations that treat legal as a strategic partner from those that don't, and what emerging risks healthcare leaders may not be paying enough attention to right now. This is Health Law Pulse. Jeff, Greg, welcome to Health Law Pulse. Thank you for taking some time out of your very busy schedules to join me on a warm Friday afternoon. I'm sure there are many things that you'd rather be doing. Not many, but just a handful of others. I appreciate that. So first of all, before we dive in, I just wanted to let you know we're making Health Law Pulse history today. First of all, yeah, this is a big deal. As I mentioned to Jeff earlier, for the fives of listeners, this is this is this is going to be a trivia answer. First, this is the first panel we've had. Big deal. So we appreciate both of you coming on and joining us. Secondly, the only episode we've had thus far was practicing attorneys. So I've had um, one other guest that had a JD practicing as a very talented compliance professional, but not practicing attorney. So thank you for providing the legal perspective on what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm not fishing for anything, but today is my half birthday. So
Ooh. Well, happy half birthday, John.
I wasn't fishing for anything. My wife hasn't said anything to me yet today, and no one's really mentioned it. But I appreciate you saying something. Okay, so before we dive in, Jeff, Greg, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, just briefly, your background, what you're doing now, and you sort of what brought you into this journey of healthcare. Jeff, you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure. So, my background, I started out as a white collar litigator. I was at a firm in New York for 7 or 8 years. Did a brief stint as a insurance defense lawyer, which was just frankly a terrible job. I did like industrial explosions and multi fatality trucking accidents. So, whatever issues one might have about healthcare, particularly in the private sector, it is substantially less ethically fraught than what I was doing before.
Mm.
So that was nice. So my healthcare legal career, I started out at DaVita with both of these fine gentlemen, and really learned a lot of what I know about healthcare law from the two of you, and then our other colleagues there. Left DaVita in 2018. Went to a PE backed uh, pharmacy and tox lab called Cordant Health Solutions. And now I am the general counsel at Evio Pharmacy Solutions. And I guess as my own general counsel, I need to just note here that anything I talk about here is in my personal capacity, not as a representative of the company. Um, and then I have also very recently, as of the beginning of this year, taken on an additional business role, which is new for me. So I am both the general counsel at Evio, and I also run our pharma manufacturer contracting business line.
Excellent, excellent. That's got a lot on your plate there. So, well, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. And Greg, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, John. Like Jeff, I was in private practice for a number of years. I'm now creeping up on 20 years of practice of law. I got started in healthcare on a key tam relator case involving a clinical laboratory at a hospital, and I was hooked. And I went in house. My first in house job was at DaVita with you guys. I did a stint after about 6 years at DaVita with a nonprofit health system called Multicare out in the Pacific Northwest for 3 years. And these days, I am Associate General Counsel at Acumen, which is a leading radiology and oncology services company. And I have responsibility for our regulatory affairs, as well as being a first point of legal contact for all of our brick and mortar radiology clinics. And like Jeff, thanks, Jeff, all of my comments today are my own and not Acumen's.
Got it. Got it. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And so what I love, I was really excited about having both of you on, especially at the same time, is you're both very well versed in healthcare law. You're both excellent attorneys, and but you kind of sit in different areas, different parts of the healthcare ecosystem, and that's really an important, I think, discussion to have. One thing I've learned practicing healthcare law, Greg, for about the same amount of time as you, is risk is highly dependent, but depending on where you sit in that healthcare ecosystem, you can, you mentioned working for a large health system, you can have a large integrated health system that has layers of, and just as an example, reimbursement complexity, physician alignment issues, regulatory exposure, that can be really extensive. But when you move into more specialized healthcare companies, whether it's diagnostics, pharmacy, analytics, the risk profile often becomes more concentrated and sometimes more scrutinized, and that risk looks very different. So, like I mentioned, both of you sit in very different parts of healthcare system, from diagnostic provider organizations, Jeff, pharmacy, medication analytics. How does a regulatory risk profile of a large health system versus a specialized healthcare company versus, Jeff, kind of what you do in the pharmacy space, how does that differ in these different areas of the healthcare space? Jeff, you want to get us started?
Yeah, so right, most of my career up until this new, until like 2022 when I started with Evio, I was in the provider space, both at DaVita and at Cordon. And there, and I'll let Greg speak more to this because he's still playing in that sandbox. That you have the False Claims Act, you have the anti-kickback statute, you have beneficiary inducement, all of those things that are provider focused risk. So when I shifted to Evio, I really had to unlearn a lot of risk areas that I'd been focused on previously, because Evio sits in this kind of weird space where we're not a provider. We're not ourselves a payer. Evio is a joint venture of 6 Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, and we help them with a lot of behind the scenes work, doing analytics, doing medication contracting, where we go out and meet with pharma and create discount agreements and then pass those on to them. So our risk is really pretty diffuse in a lot of ways, because we don't have traditional payer risk either, because we're not the payer. So one of the things that I have been trying to keep focused on for myself is, what are the risks in this space that are different than I would face if I were a provider? And one of those that popped up this week when we were talking to a regulator in New Jersey is, there's a product that we're putting together that has a reinsurance component. So one of the questions was, well, are you guys signed up as a licensed insurance producer in the state of New Jersey? And not a thing that would have ever been an issue for me in the provider space, but it's that sort of state level licensing risk, which is what I'm trying to now be a little bit more attuned to in the place that that Evio is in right now.
Interesting. So the insurance risk is very interesting. I hadn't really thought about that in your space. I mean, it really only comes up in the provider space. Greg, you may have some other thoughts, but when a provider group takes on a risk, because in some states they may consider that, depending on how they're taking on that risk, to be an insurance product. So yeah, a lot of differences for sure. Maybe some overlap. But Greg, how about you in the provider space? Especially in your experience now in kind of the diagnostic space versus like a large integrated health system. How does the risk differ depending on those different spaces in healthcare?
Yeah. Thanks, John. Good question. Hard question to answer. I think two areas that I've focused on throughout my career, at least during my in-house practice, has been on joint ventures, affiliations, and other strategic partnerships, and then secondarily on reimbursement issues. Um, and setting aside, I think, some of the thornier regulatory issues facing health systems like 340B, for example. If you just look at things that I know pretty well, transactions, reimbursement matters, my observation is that health systems have a greater degree of regulatory flexibility to come up with arrangements to deliver care without triggering state and federal program integrity laws. But they tend to have a lesser degree of flexibility when it comes to like certificate of need, material transaction reviews, antitrust laws, especially with some of the state legislatures recently sitting up and becoming more active in the wake of like the Stewart bankruptcy up in the Northeast. I liked the word that you used for more specialized or niche providers, and that word was concentrated. In the specialized provider space, I tend to orient my thinking about regulatory risks around whether the provider is billing payers directly for the service or is simply acting as the furnishing provider under arrangements with a hospital or some other customer. And beyond that, I tend to think that specialized providers have less flexibility than health systems when it comes to structuring arrangements that are consistent with state and federal program integrity laws. It's just the flip of some of the safe harbors and exceptions that I think have been created specifically with hospitals in mind.
Right. Thank you for that. Very interesting to me how in the healthcare space, you can have so many different layers of within the regulatory landscape, right? We're talking about very different areas of healthcare, even within care delivery, right? And a lot of different areas within that landscape, within that ecosystem. You have the state overlay of what their regulatory landscape looks like. You have the federal overlay. You've got all kinds of other things, but very different. So the risks are different. What I find interesting is that despite those differences, a lot of compliance failures. If we just think about compliance itself within the healthcare space, they look remarkably similar across organizations, and I represent a large, very wide variety of different provider types and healthcare companies, and it's interesting when there is a compliance issue. Yeah, the risks are different. Some of those, like kind of the root of compliance issue, tends to be very similar, regardless different structures, different services, very similar, same recurring themes. Jeff, I know you and your investigation work that you've done in the past within the healthcare space. I'm sure I've seen that. You've seen a lot of compliance failures, I'm sure. And even amongst different organizations, different teams, there are a lot of common themes. Communication gaps, governance issues, usually a process that made sense years ago hasn't been revisited since. Healthcare organizations vary widely in size and specialty, but these compliance challenges almost seem universal. So what lessons about compliance and governance translate across every healthcare organization, regardless of size or specialty, Jeff?
Yes, I think one of the things that I've seen is that it is very rarely an issue of a real bad actor. I mean, those are out there, but in most cases, it's a misunderstanding of what the rules are, or in a lot of cases, I think that it is really just a failure to issue spot by somebody along the line that nobody was there to raise their hand and say, "Wait a second, this might be an issue." John, like you and I were talking about before the show, I encountered this in my own lane 2 weeks ago. That as a business owner, business lane owner, as well as the general counsel, I had an issue where we had to solve a particular problem, and I was wearing my business hat and I was kicking it around with folks on the business team. And then we sent it across the wire to a partner or potential partner company. And then I talked to my assistant general counsel and chief compliance officer a little bit later in our weekly one-on-one and just mentioned it. She said, "Well, wait a second. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that?" And I hadn't realized that despite the fact that I am also the general counsel of the company, I had missed those issues myself. And I care very much about following the rules, following our policies, reviewing things by legal. Made the mistake of thinking that I could review it myself and be my own lawyer.
Objective, kind of outside looking in view of
Yeah, and missed a thing. And fortunately didn't wind up being a big deal, fixable. Now, having had that experience, I put myself in the space of other business people that are just thinking, "Oh, this is fine." Right? I'm not aware. This doesn't match any issue that I've run into in the past or that I've been trained on or that legal has told me is a problem. So I'm just not thinking about it and I go do it, then it trips some kind of wire that I wasn't even looking for. And I think that that's where a lot, that my sense is that's the number one thing is that people are just not thinking that what they're doing is actually against the rules.
Right. Yeah. No, I've seen that quite a bit. I totally agree with that. Greg, what do you think? You've worked for a lot of different provider types, had a stint in private practice as well, where I'm sure you represent a lot of different healthcare companies, provider types. Thoughts on some of the commonalities among healthcare organizations on compliance issues?
Yeah, I guess the organizations I feel like have been most successful at either managing compliance issues or overcoming them have been the ones that tend to orient their missions and their core values to patients first, and then maybe staff, frontline healthcare staff up there as well. The organizations that I really admire are the ones that just have a habit as part of their culture of talking about compliance related problems around what's best for patients, what's best for frontline staff. And that I think that really helps with legal and compliance professionals when they have to go to and sit down with either business executives internally or perhaps counterparties in business arrangements or even regulators to explain what happened. And if you have the patients and frontline staff kind of at the front of your mind there, I think that tends to lead to better outcomes on average.
Yeah, I like that, and I agree with that. You start with patient safety, start with quality healthcare delivery, and sort of back up from there. I think that makes a lot of sense. I agree with that.
Just to double down on that, so in my experience, having to defend these things on the back end, that even if you have a foot fault, if you're dealing with enforcement folks and you can explain that the reason that you were doing something is for patient care reasons, that usually gets you a long way towards solving the problem.
Yeah, I like that. It's not just like a cultural issue. It's really from an enforcement perspective, start with clinical quality, start with patient safety, focus on that, and let everything kind of just stem from that. Yeah, I mean, you create a good culture, a good compliant culture if that's your main focus and everything is derived from that. I like that. Thanks
Yeah.
for
I've had situations where a regulator has said, too bad, here's your medicine, where business executives that I've worked with have said, look, you know what? We're going to take this one on the chin, but we feel good about how we behaved here,
Yeah.
even though a regulator may have disagreed.
yeah.
Fair. And I think on the payer side too, the corollary is if you were thinking about like what is the overall cost for patients and the system, and if the things that you were doing are focused on bringing down patient costs and lowering costs to the system to either drive down premiums or price at the door for patients, then that's usually going to be a pretty good guiding star too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, that's all great. I appreciate that insight. I want to shift gears a little bit. One of my favorite topics to talk about are ways of working. So I want to focus on that a little bit. Greg, I'll start with you. In my experience, compliance program don't just succeed or fail based on policies. It's really how well legal compliance operations, clinical business executives actually work together. Now, on paper, that alignment can look really clean. In practice, it can feel more like three groups trying to solve the same problem from slightly different angles, different objectives, different thoughts, mindsets. Of course, there's that natural tension that exists in a group like that. Both of you have spent a lot of your careers working in house where legal is embedded directly within the organization. What does, in your view, a really effective partnership between these teams look like, between legal compliance operations look like? What does that look like in practice, Greg?
Yeah. By the way, plug for the podcast for anybody who hasn't listened to the other episodes. You've had some great guests so far, including some folks who've been really thoughtful about ways of working. I liked how you put that. For my part, I guess I've developed a habit over my career of trying to have really a more of a business conversation up front to talk about what is the reason that you want to do this thing and maybe even get into some tactics that tends to surface early any daylight between the legal and compliance teams and the business about what exactly it is that they're trying to do, and get a good understanding of of the objective. Assuming good intent always, I think that that can go a long ways in creating good teamwork, and then having good policies and procedures in place to guide the way and getting the work done. I really feel much more comfortable when I can point to something to say, look, here's how we're going to approach this issue. Here's the process. Here are the key reviewers. Here are the milestones or gates that we're going to put up to get through before we sign on the dotted line or implement the project or whatever the end deliverable is. But I think those things that I've learned over time through working with really good teams lead to really good results between legal, compliance, and operations.
Great insight. Yeah, I appreciate that. And thanks for the plug too. Jeff, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, agree with everything that Greg said, and the twist I guess I'd put on it is that the more you can do as a legal department or as a lawyer to show the business that you are on their side, and that can be as easy as communicate, meet your deadlines, create value for the business, right? When they ask you to go negotiate something that they need into a contract or whatever the case may be, figure out how to do it, and you get them wins, and um, then you create a relationship where they are knocking on your door, they are bringing things proactively to you, they want you at the table as part of product design, as part of thinking through problems, and not as the cop. And that also gives you the credibility. Having worked with them, they know that you empathize with them. You know that they know that you understand what their win conditions are and what they're evaluated on and what metrics they have to hit. And that way, if you have to have hard conversations about, look, we can't do this thing that you have spent a lot of time on because it creates an unacceptable level of risk, that creates the trust that's really critical in the hopefully rare instances where that sort of discussion becomes necessary.
Yeah, that's good. So this is really the points that both of you brought up, really consistent to Greg's point. I've had other guests on in the past, not in the legal aspect, but in compliance and others that have put forth very similar points in terms of how to accomplish this. So I was just writing down, I think, some main takeaways that I gathered from both of your comments. Understanding business objectives, number one. Understanding the win criteria, really important. Show the other teams that you're on their team, and how can you provide value, and then assume good intentions. I really like that, Greg. Assume good intentions and help with and be a facilitator in terms of policies and procedures and project plan to accomplish the objectives. I mean, it's true whether you're talking about legal, compliance, clinical operations. That probably doesn't really matter. The common thing that I've gathered from this is how do we become someone who is trusted, that they will come to with things proactively, that they'll say, hey, John, I've got this idea. Not to use the word buzzword thought partner, but I'll use it. We become a thought partner here with me. Let's kind of hammer this out, as opposed to, hey, here's what we did, or here's what we're going to do tomorrow at 3 o'clock. What are your thoughts? And obviously very different atmosphere. I have to imagine that all of us have been in situations on both sides of that pendulum. What to you, just quick thoughts on any warning signs of that type of relationship existing, or how do you get past, other than what we've described, this, we've been in cultures where, I don't know, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, in culture um, where legal maybe was viewed as an impediment. I mean, it's not really a culture. Maybe it's just an individual thought, right? And you deal with individuals that think, I'm not going to legal because they say no to everything, or I can't get anything done. How do you get past that, or what are some warning signs that kind of help you get in front of that?
When I left DaVita to go to Corden, I had that issue initially with one of the business leaders there that I think she was really, really hesitant to go to me. She, had this sense that everything you were saying, right? And one of the things that I realized was um, that I had not adjusted my thinking about risk tolerance. Going from DaVita, a billion-dollar company that was under a CIA at the time, to a much smaller PE-backed company that was on sell phase and had very different objectives. And that the problem really there was on me. It was that I hadn't adjusted the way that I was working correctly. So we sat down and kind of hashed it out. And I said, look, it seems like you are really frustrated with the guidance that I'm providing. What are we talking about? And she laid out a whole bunch of things um, that I hadn't really been thinking about. And what it made me realize is that I didn't really understand the business that I was paid to provide guidance to. And if you don't understand the business, then you can't really empathize
Right.
with the people who are working in the business. And I think that empathy is really the most critical thing, that understanding and empathy of what are the challenges of the business, what are the goals, what is the risk tolerance from the leadership and ownership on down. Obviously there are going to be always some bright line, nope, sorry, this is illegal, can't do it. But getting a sense of what's the cadence of decision making that you need to hit. Is this a place where everybody wants 110% accuracy and triple checked everything, or is this an 80/20 shop, and we're good with that because we're in a different industry, different phase of the company's life cycle, different size. Understanding all of those things is really critical, and if you're misaligned on any of those, I think it can create a lot of frustration with the business. At the end of the day, it's on the lawyers to make sure that you know the business that you're working in.
Yeah. I love that. So step number one is really understanding the business and risk tolerance, right? And that's excellent. Greg, any thoughts on that?
Well, I had the same experience that Jeff had, just at a different organization. I went to a nonprofit health system after DaVita, and I too had to um, uh, reorient some of my prior notions about what compliance and risk mitigation for a large healthcare provider looked like. Even getting taken aside by someone who later became a mentor to me, to just say, um, we've got all kinds of ways of structuring an arrangement here that we can cover under a relevant exception or safe harbor, and that we're not under a CIA. And you had a level of scrutiny for 5 years under a CIA that most healthcare organizations aren't experiencing. And even if they've gone through one, once it's done, it's not that you can back off, but there was kind of a level of intensity during that I think caused me to lose a little bit of perspective of what other healthcare providers experience.
No, those are excellent points. One thing I'll add as we leave this topic, but not necessarily related to this specifically, but some of the best advice that I received was, and I know not everyone listening to this is a lawyer, but for those that are and that are in house, and I don't think it just applies to lawyers. I think it applies to those in compliance and in other areas. But when I started my first in-house job, I kind of struggled with my role as an in-house lawyer. I'd only been in private practice, and some of your comments about going uh, from organization to organization that maybe had different risk tolerances. I was experiencing some of that just going from private practice, where it was more project-based work, to in-house, where you're really in a collaborative team, which was awesome, and I had a great experience. But I sort of struggled the first 6 months to find my place with the business. And one of the senior vice presidents pulled me aside and said, "Well, John, we hire lawyers here not because they have a law license, obviously that's really important, but because they're smart." And I said, "Well, you must be talking about Greg or Jeff. You're definitely not talking about me." But his point was that, hey, when we want your thoughts and opinions on things outside of just what is a legal risk or what is the legal issue here, give us your thoughts on that, which totally changed my way of looking at, essentially every meeting I had after that was, I think I have more to contribute than, here's the legal risk. Now, some business folks don't want to hear anything you have to say except for what is the legal risk. But regardless, we're also, I hate using this twice in one episode. We can be good thought partners, and that's true for legal, compliance, operations. I mean, it's all a collaborative team. We're just in different disciplines in different areas.
I think the risk of the lawyers being perceived as an obstacle, or maybe like a check the box type activity, is that you end up having high value employees, or maybe expensive resources. Maybe that's one way of thinking about it, doing what I consider to be somewhat lower value work because you're not to the person you were just describing to that person's point, you're not harnessing, you're not leveraging any of the knowledge that the lawyer can bring to the table. And ultimately, I think that can be kind of corrosive to morale. And then word gets around, and then at least for the lawyers and compliance professionals, that becomes a place perceived as hostile or not a good place to work for legal and compliance folks.
Yep.
And I think it also potentially just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy
Right.
because if legal and compliance just get brought in at the end after something is has been fully baked and designed and in many cases shared externally or whatever the case may be, then at that point, it really often is a like you are making the go no go decision. When you tell people there's a problem, then you're blowing up deadlines, you're blowing up implementation schedules, you're potentially scuttling deals that people have spent time on. Versus if you were in a true partnership and you're brought in early or you have the opportunity to come in early and work collaboratively alongside the business to help develop the product, develop the relationship or whatever you're looking to do, then you can identify those and sort of nudge things in the right direction so that you don't become a no.
Yeah. No, excellent.
Great point.
Thank you for that. Perfect. So I want to shift gears one more time, and I want to look prospectively. Let's look into the future. We have a lot of many years of experience on this panel in the healthcare industry, and we know that healthcare is evolving very quickly with rising healthcare costs. You got new payment models, you got new technologies, you got AI. I talked. My guest last week was someone who works for a technology platform that is really designed to facilitate compliance programs. But we talked a lot about AI in this space. More data analytics, more integration across systems. And it feels like a lot of times that risk is shifting faster than organizations can fully really adapt to it. So, in both of your opinions, what trends do you think care leaders maybe underestimating, and maybe that's not the right word, but maybe high on their radar if they're not underestimating it right now from a legal and compliance perspective?
I've got two. One thing that I think is being underestimated is how healthcare policy at the federal level is actually leading to more uncertainty for regulated industry. And I think that's creating some difficulties in engaging with regulators to get guidance
Mm.
before it leads to enforcement. And I think that has led to or may lead to a deterioration in the business environment for growth, the willingness to invest in new arrangements. And I guess I shouldn't say it's exclusive to the federal level because I think there are shifting sands at the state level as well, including in the legislatures. But I called out the policy at the federal level because it's sort of paradoxical that, like, sort of a drive to deregulate has actually led to more uncertainty for providers as a result, where you would think that the opposite would be true. That's the first thing. The second thing is I do think that healthcare leaders are underestimating their level of preparedness for like disaster recovery operations in the event of a major cybersecurity incident. And my hunch is that some of it is fatigue because they keep being told it's not a matter of if, but when. And then as a result, it's sort of the fated that this will happen, and then as a result, it's like, well, if it's going to happen to me, you would think that that would prompt people to get prepared. On the other hand, it's like, well, if this is going to happen to me, no matter what I do, then how much preparedness should I actually engage in if I can't prevent it altogether?
Right. No, that's great. That's great. Jeff, any thoughts?
Yeah. So on the regulatory front, I think one of the things that we are seeing that is probably underweighted is that, and this sort of piggybacks on Greg's point. I think uh, because Congress has such a hard time getting anything meaningful done, that in a lot of areas, states are taking up the lead role in regulating all sorts of things from PBM regulation to AI regulation to employment regulation. And at the same time that we're having like an increased level of fragmentation of the regulatory landscape, we're also seeing an industry that used to be very state focused where you had individual provider groups or healthcare systems or insurance companies that operated basically in one state or in a finite number of states and knew what those regulatory operations were. You're seeing through, through mergers and acquisitions, through, the spread of online health operations, that you have now smaller healthcare companies with smaller legal and compliance resources operating over a much wider regulatory footprint with a lot of challenges in understanding, with the deep nuance, what exactly the rules are in each state that you might be operating on. Like back in the day, you might have, you know, a $200 million healthcare company would be like, a good sized hospital or medium sized health system with a team that deeply knows the law in their state. Now that same size company in terms of revenue is maybe a PE-backed roll-up with operations in 30 states, or you might be a telehealth company that's operating in 50 states, and you've still only got like one or two lawyers who are expected to now understand what the rules are everywhere. I think that's a particular challenge. And then on the AI front, I think that as much as healthcare leaders and legal teams and compliance teams and data governance teams are moving quickly to implement processes and data governance plans and AI usage plans, the speed at which the industry is changing and the degree to which AI is being inserted into all manner of different products, I think is just happening faster than it's possible to really put processes in place. Maybe it takes 6 months to roll out an AI policy or to update it in a meaningful way and train people on it. During those 6 months, the whole AI industry and what it's doing has changed. So you're almost always out of date and kind of behind the eight ball, and trying to stay on top of all of that is a huge challenge.
Yeah, those are awesome. Excellent points. And not just as technology growing and progressively getting better exponentially, but the regulations can't keep up with it. And so I totally agree with that. I've had people on before just talk about data. If we talk about data, how can we use our own data? And a lot of companies out there using to build their own AI tools. And granted, to be, I think, more efficient, to increase operational efficiency. There's real value in that. But are we using that data in a way that's compliant? Is when we contract with someone else and we are giving them data to process for us, maybe as a business associate, are they using that data for any other purpose, whether it's aggregated or not? That is, everyone wants to use data, and a lot of them to build AI tools. And how's that regulated? That's a big one. The 50 state comment that you had about like a 50 state medical group, that's huge. I was having a conversation with someone not too long ago about just what you described. When you're talking about scope of practice, you're talking about all kinds of different state level issues, from consent to, in the telehealth world, it's not everything's black and white, but it's certainly not black and white when you are trying to decipher what every state does. Some states don't address it, and it is a nightmare, especially when you're working with limited resources to try to figure that out.
Yeah, and I think, and particularly if you think about like who the regulators are in some
Yeah.
states, not to dump on like boards of pharmacy, but just as an example, right? And a lot of the time the boards of pharmacy in a particular state are these groups that are made up of a handful of independent practitioners that are totally operating in it. Their practice is very different than the chain groups or whatever that are doing things in other places. And they do not have any concern about putting together very state specific picking rules or regulatory systems, because they are focused on, okay, well, I know the rules in my state. How hard can it be for people to follow those rules if you're going to practice in this state? And my guess is that all sorts of bodies are doing that. And, I mean, for lawyers, we see the same thing. State bar associations have their own. And none of this is consistent with the new, nationalized work remotely from anywhere kind of system where you could be subject to regulatory regimes simply because of where you sit or where the CEO of your company sits. Keeping track of all of those things is hugely important, but it is a huge challenge for resource strapped, capacity strapped legal teams.
So
Yep.
true. Yeah, great Great comments, great insight, great advice. I know you're both avid listeners of Health Law Pulse, so you know that I like to close each episode with a rapid fire sort of lightning round, where I ask some questions. Now, this started last episode, but the lightning round is actually sponsored. Jeff, Gray, I know you're gonna. Okay, I can see you guys are already laughing, but it is sponsored. So the lightning round is sponsored by a company called Western Associates. And it's a company that helps organizations create high quality brand merchandise and corporate products. High quality products people want to keep. But if your organization is looking to elevate its brand through custom merchandise, you can learn more at westernassociates.com or contact my buddy Mike Eldridge at Eldridge, ELDRIDGE, at westernassociates.com. Mike's a good guy, and he can hook you up if you're looking for corporate branded merchandise.
I think that's cool. That's cool. You're getting some sponsorship. I want to see this podcast take off. I think it's great.
Appreciate that.
And I've just been in conversations on Slack earlier today about corporate merch. So
All right. Well, there you go. And then
highly timely, John.
I appreciate that. I'm going to include a link in the episode description where you can find out more information. But he's a good guy and it's a good organization. Okay, I'm going to get you out on this lightning round. So, best skill an in-house healthcare lawyer needs that law school never teaches. Jeff.
Empathy.
Oh wow, Greg, who's full of empathy? Go for it.
Flexibility.
Biggest trend in healthcare regulation over the next 5 years.
PBM reform.
Oh, Greg, is that yours?
Yeah. Well, no, I don't want to touch that one. AI.
Yeah. One area of healthcare that regulators will focus on more in the next decade.
340B.
Yeah.
Okay. I agree, but since I can't take the same thing, I will say ownership and disclosure requirements for care providers.
Excellent. Jeff, most interesting job you had before becoming a lawyer?
I was Al Gore's deputy field director in Broward County, Florida, and was there for the Counting Chads debacle.
Really? I did not know that. All right. Greg, I probably know yours. What is yours?
Working at a dry cleaner. No, just kidding. I was on a firefighting crew in the Forest Service for many years, and that was a lot of fun. But it is for a young person, not an older person like me.
Excellent. What is the book you're reading now or podcast that you're listening to besides Health Law?
Besides Health Law Pulse,
of course.
Yeah, I am reading as part of an online like classic literature book club. I'm reading the 200-year-old French novel The Red and the Black by Stendhal, and I am listening to the Revolutions podcast, season 10 on the Russian Revolution.
Wow.
I am reading Hamnet, and I have not seen the movie yet.
You don't have to read it. They came out with the movie. You don't even need to read it.
And podcast, I believe it or not, I still listen to reruns of Click and Clack's Car Talk on NPR.
Oh, okay. Very good. Very good. Of course you do. Yes, that's good. That's good. Well, hey, Jeff, Greg, thank you so much for your time. I sincerely appreciate it. The insight that you both brought today from your different perspectives has been so valuable, and just, the wisdom bombs you've dropped on all of us. We certainly appreciate it. So thank you so much, and take care.
Yeah, thanks for having us, John.
Thanks, John. Keep up the good work.
That's it for this episode of Health Law Pulse, where our main goal is to just not put you to sleep. Does it get any more exciting than three lawyers bantering about healthcare law? The answer to that is no, it does not. I want to thank Jeff and Greg for their great insight and for carving out some time from their busy schedules to share those insights with us today. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in to episode 7 of Health Law Pulse. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, please leave a review, please share with a friend. We are on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. You can also find links to these episodes on my website at www.healthlawcouncil.com. We'll be back soon with more conversations at the intersection of healthcare, law, technology, and leadership. Take care.